So Charles Barnard and his men offer the castaways a great deal, a humanitarian deal. And the British, all except for one or two, say, no, no, it's fine. We understand there's a war broken out. We're enemies technically, but you're doing the right thing. You're saving us. You're giving us a lifeline. We accept it. Thank you very much.
This is CBS Eye on the World. I'm John Batchelor. Let's go sealing. A new book, Left for Dead, Shipwreck, Treachery, and Survival at the Edge of the World. This is not only sealing, a very, very lucrative occasion about the time of the revolution into the early 19th century. It's also a story about the Falkland Islands that once were at the edge of the world and are now in the conversation all the time between Argentina and the United Kingdom. They remain part of the British Empire, British Commonwealth. However, the conversation here takes us to another collision between the young America and Mother Britain. This would be the War of 1812. Eric J. Dolin is the author. I congratulate him. The research is not only impressive, it's extremely persuasive that we're living the life of a sealer in 1812. We begin, though, with the commerce. What was it about seals or something near to something called a sea otter? Who wanted such things in great quantity that you could launch an expedition to seal for 1 or 2 years? Eric, congratulations. Good evening. What was the commerce of sealing? Who bought? Who sold? Good evening to you.
Good evening to you. Thanks for having me on. Well, sealing as an industry, the way that I first found out about it was a book I wrote years ago called Leviathan about the history of whaling in America, and then also a book I wrote called Fur, Fortune, and Empire about the history of the fur trade in America. And one of the original ways that Americans got involved in the fur trade internationally was through the sea otter trade in the Pacific Northwest. When Captain Cook on one of his voyages went to the Pacific Northwest, some of his men later in Canton sold sea otter pelts for $100 a piece, and this got everybody's attention. So the sea otter trade took off. But seal skins were also in demand in China, and Americans weren't the first to get into it. The Russians and others had done it previously, but the Americans got into it in a big way, starting in the late 1700s and the early 1800s. And these sealing operations would go to islands in the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, wherever seals congregated. They would kill fur seals and sea lions, and they would strip them of their pelts. They'd dry them out, and they'd become hard as board. And then they'd be put in the hold of the ship, and most of the seal skins would be taken to China, where there was a market for them. The high quality fur seal skins would go for $5 a piece. The lower quality hair seal or sea lion skins would go for about 35 or 50 cents a piece. But you get a sense of how large this industry was when you realize that from the late 1700s to the early 1800s, somewhere in the order of 3.5 million to maybe as few as 2.5 million seal skins were taken to China. So it's a relatively large industry, and it has an interesting connection to whaling in that a lot of whaling ships, when they went to islands that had seal populations, they would also take the opportunity to kill seals, strip them of their skins to make a little bit extra profit beyond the whale oil and baleen that they would get from the whales. So it was a major industry within the United States, the new country, and many ships went out. And one of them, of course, is the one we're going to talk about, the Nanina.
The Nanina, a young man named Charles Barnard, shows up at the offices of Murray and Son with a proposal for sealing. Charles Barnard is a veteran sealer. He's worked for the Murray and Son before, and now he's proposing what looks to be high risk. What does he want to do, and why do Murray and Son go along?
Yeah, it's very high risk because it was right in the eve of what everybody expected to be a second American Revolution or second war with Great Britain. And as a result, a lot of sealing voyages had stopped in the years leading up to 1812 because a lot of British ships were impressing American sailors on merchant vessels, and a lot of American merchants decided that it was better to stay in port than risk their men and their ships. But Barnard was a risk taker, as was Murray and Son, and they perceived that because sealing vessels and sealing expeditions had been reduced in recent years, there'd be a pent-up demand in China. They might be the only sealing operation out there. They also, many people were out of work, like Barnard and other sealing captains and sealing crew. So they really looked at this as an opportunity to make some money in tough times. So he proposed it to Murray and Son. They knew that the war was possibly in the offing, and actually there was an embargo placed on sailing out of New York Harbor right when they left, and they knew that it was about to be handed down by Congress and the president. And you always place an embargo on sailing 60 or 90 days out from when you think a war might erupt, because you want to give the ships that are at sea time to return to port and not be threatened by the then what would be the enemy. So Barnard and Murray, big risk takers, they zipped out of New York Harbor right when the embargo was placed on the harbor. And Barnard and the 13 men he was with headed down to the Falkland Islands to go sealing. But the war had not broken out yet.
Let's build the crew the way Melville builds the crew with Ahab in the preacher's sermon. We've talked about Charles Barnard. The important member of the crew is his dad, Valentine Barnard. What do we need to know
Right.
about him?
Valentine Barnard is 63 years old at the time, a veteran sealing captain and mariner. They're both from Hudson, New York, and they relocated to New York City shortly before this voyage. He is very advanced age to be on a voyage like this. And he actually has two hernias and he's sort of held together by multiple trusses. But the reason he's on the voyage is that his son asked him to come along, because the idea was that you go down to the Falklands, you seal for the better part of a year. If you're able to collect a lot of seal skins, half of the crew would stay on the Falklands, continued sealing. The Nanina, this 73-foot brig, would go north back to New York, take all the skins that they've gotten so far, offload them in New York. They'd be sent to China, and the lesser quality ones would be sent to England, probably. And then the ship would return to the Falklands to pick up the men who had continued sealing, gathered more seal skins, and then they'd head around Cape Horn up to China. So Valentine was picked specifically to go down with the ship, not do any sealing because he's too old and a little bit infirm. But once the ship was ready to return, loaded with cargo to New York, he would be the master mariner, the captain that would sail the Nanina back to New York, leaving his son and about half of the men on the Falklands to continue sealing.
The crew is also important because there are a number of sealing captains, sealing whaling captains on
Right.
board. One of them keeps an excellent diary. Pease. What do we need to
Yes.
know about Pease?
Barzillai Pease was also from Hudson, New York. He had a difficult early life. He grew up with a father who was very demanding, very nasty to him at times, and that greatly affected Barzillai Pease's personality and outlook on the world. But nevertheless, Pease ran off at one point and went whaling, and then he went sealing. So he was a well-trained mariner, and he finally became a captain of a ship in the early 1800s. Continued to have a rocky relationship with his father, but he got married, started his own family. And on the Nanina, there were four sealing captains. That's a recipe for disaster in most voyages, because captains, especially in the age of sail, are used to giving orders and being listened to. So the fact that you had four captains on one ship could create potential problems, and it did, in fact, create some problems. But they were all unemployed because there were no sealing voyages going out. So they leapt at the opportunity to invest some of their own money in this enterprise, hop on the ship, and take orders from Charles Barnard on the way down and on the Falklands.
The money. The money is to be divided between Murray and Son and Charles and the crew. He,
Right.
Charles gets 48%. How does he assign who gets what? Is that entirely up to him, or is
No,
there?
no, there was a contract beforehand, and the other captains, the high-ranking individuals would have gotten "quote unquote" larger shares, just like they have on whaling voyages. And the common crew, the carpenter, the cook, and the deckhands, they would have gotten a smaller share. The exact division of spoils, I don't know for this voyage.
The research is endless, so let us head to the Falklands, which is
Okay.
unknown at this time of of America, unknown except for you can make money there because there are lots of seals. The book
Lots of
is Left for Dead, Shipwreck, Treachery, and Survival at the Edge of the World. This is a story of sealing. It's also the story of War of 1812. It's also the story of Australia. We're going to go to the Falklands first because that has been in the news in the 20th century and may again be in the 21st. Argentina is a reawakened economy, but the Falklands have a lot of seals. They're not the sea otters that are now hunted out, but they are divided into fur seals and skin seals. What's hair seals? What's the difference, Eric?
It's just the quality of the coat that's viewed by the consumers, which are primarily the Chinese. Fur seal skins are much more lustrous. They're softer to the touch. They have fewer guard hairs, so they are in higher demand. The hair seals or the sea lions have a rougher pelt. But it's also important to mention one other thing that they were down there for, and that is elephant seals. They slaughtered elephant seals, these gargantuan animals, over a ton apiece, and they would melt down their blubber, which would create an illuminant that was second only to sperm whale oil in quality of burning and in price. So they were really there for the skins and the blubber from the sea elephants. But if you felt a fur seal skin and a sea lion skin, they would feel different to your touch, and people paid accordingly for them.
The Falklands are 700 islands, maybe many more.
Yeah.
Eric says in a footnote, it's up to you how many you count here. Some are just rocks that are underwater in high tide, but it's divided into two major pieces. That's the Spanish Maloon and the English Maloon. It has a history. What's important here is nobody's there at this moment in time. Is that correct, Eric?
That is correct. In the previous decades, there had been French settlement, English settlement, and Spanish settlements at various times, and many Westerners had seen the Falklands in earlier centuries, and thus creates the tangled web of who deserves ownership or first discovery of the Falklands. But right before the War of 1812, in the years leading up to the War of 1812, the British had already left, and then the Spanish in 1811 left an outpost that they had there. The men on the Nanina didn't know much about the politics of the Falklands, but when we get into the brig coming from Australia, the Isabella, there was a little bit more understanding about what had happened on the Falklands. So anyway,
This is the world turned upside down, remember. Summer
yes,
is our winter in the North Temperate Zone. So
yes,
January, January, February, March are really good months.
yes,
June, July, August are really bad months because the wind always blows in the Falklands. It
right.
has the unique ecology. We talked about the seals. There are no trees, but there's something that grows very tall. Tussock, is that how you say that?
Tussock grass. Yeah, tussock grass. It's amazing. It can live for up to 200 years and grow up to 9 feet tall, and it creates a very dense layer of peat that is high in organic content that is very useful in creating fires and maintaining fires. And yeah, it's a very barren, sort of inhospitable place, the Falklands. During the summer months, the average temperature is only 49 degrees, and during the winter months, it plummets to 36 degrees. But as you said, the average wind speed year round is 18 miles per hour. So that creates quite a chill, and there's no barriers to protect you. There are no trees. The tussock grass creates a little bit of a barrier, but you are basically out in the open, constantly being pelted by cold wind.
We leave Nanina and the experienced crew sealing with clubs. See, the seals
Yep.
are not afraid of humans, or when they are afraid of humans, they can't run away. And we go to Sydney. This is Australia, which
Mhm.
was honestly an offloading, emptying the jails of Britain. They're no longer available in America because America was independent, so they emptied them in Australia. But there's the ship Isabella sailing for London. On board is quite a mixture, Eric. Every element of rascal, but the captains are important. They're
Yes,
reckless men.
yes.
Uh, and and once you're on board one of these ships, I take it the captain has absolute authority.
Yes, he has absolute authority. George Higton, the captain, proved to be a miserable choice. He was I'm sure, a drunk. He certainly drank a lot. He liked to play cards with some of the other crewmen. And on board, there were 54 people on board the Isabella. There was the crew, but there were 34 passengers, including 14 armed Marines and 10 convicts or former convicts, ones that had either been pardoned or had served out their terms in the penal colony of New South Wales, which we know as Australia. And four of those former convicts were female prostitutes, and one of them shacked up with the captain, George Higton, and the ship almost ran aground south of New Zealand, barely made it around Cape Horn, and then crashed into the Falkland Islands, which was not their intended goal, of course. And all of that can be laid at the hands of George Higton's ineptitude and shirking of his responsibility as a captain.
Uh, Eric's book is beautifully laid out, lots of illustrations, and the map shows you how you ask yourself, how did they manage to crash into the rocks on Eagle Island? That's in the Falkland Sound. They're not even close to passing by the Falklands.
Right. It was they didn't have good maps at the time. It was dark and stormy, as they say, and he wasn't a particularly good mariner. And fortunately, there was another captain on board of transport ships, a guy named Brooks, who took command at the last moment and possibly kept them from even more grief. Because although the Isabella was a total wreck, it wrecked relatively close to shore, and everybody on board made it to shore alive.
Unfortunately, there was a lot of wine with them as well. So the bad behavior of the captain and some members of the crew, members of the former convicts, misbehaved all the way through. Here they are, shipwrecked. And at this point, I want to make an observation. I think that they believe they're going to die there, don't they? I mean, they have no.
Oh, yeah. Yes, many of them. This story is so common in the annals of the great age of sail. After shipwrecks, the crewmen breaking into the alcohol and getting rip-roaring drunk. It is a very common story, and I'm sure many of them thought that was the end. The Falklands is nowhere. It's far away from any civilization, and their ship is totally destroyed. But they did have a 17 and a half foot longboat, and
Right.
they did send off a rescue mission. But you never lose money betting on the lack of inebriety or the the pursuit of alcohol on the part of crewmen during the great age of sail.
So Nanina's somewhere on the Falklands and Isabella's crashed. When we come back, it's not going to get easier. Eric J. Dolin is the author. Left for Dead is the book. We're in the Falklands. It's 1812, 1813. There's a shipwreck coming from Australia, and women and children and men are scattered on the shore of a bleak part of the Falklands. Fortunately for them, there's a experienced sealing crew led by Charles Barnard, and they are about to see the burning grass, which suggests to them somebody's there. And here they come across the shipwreck, and the shipwreck people believe they're rescued, except, well, they are rescued in a way, Eric, except for it's going to be a long way around rescue. Who knows there's a war on and who doesn't?
Yeah, when Charles Bernard and his other sealers come upon the wrecked ship and the castaways, they are aware that war has broken out because a few months earlier, an American sealing ship came by and told them that the war had broken out. The people on board the Isabella, however, were not aware that war had broken out. So Charles Bernard and his men offer the castaways a great deal, a humanitarian deal. They say, "We're going to save you. We're going to take you back to South American port so you can go back to London. And all that we ask in return is the right to salvage the wrecked Isabella and the cargo on board, minus personal possessions." The British agree to this, but then Barnard realizes they don't know the war's broken out. And he knows that they can overpower the Americans at any moment. So he feels that it's incumbent upon him to let them know that the war has commenced. He does. They take another vote, and the British, all except for one or two, say, "No, no, it's fine. We understand there's a war broken out. We're enemies technically, but you're doing the right thing. You're saving us. You're giving us a lifeline. We accept it. Thank you very much."
Importantly, Brooks, the captain of responsibility, had set uh, a long chance to reach the
Yes.
main in an open boat. Nobody expects him to be successful in those seas.
Right.
It's winter time coming on. So
Right. Right.
Brooks has reached Montevideo and then he's steered to Buenos Aires. The adventures here are unbelievable. However, quite impossibly, Brooks does reach somebody of authority. And what is the decision in Buenos Aires?
Yeah, Peter Heywood, the British commander on station there, who is an alumnus of the mutiny on the Bounty and the Bligh saga, he immediately dispatches the HMS Nancy, captained by William Peter Duranda, to go to the Falklands to rescue the castaways. And keep in mind, he has no idea, as is the case for the people who left the Falklands to find rescue, they have no idea that there are those Americans there that are offering to help the British castaways.
It becomes extremely complicated, something like a farce at this point about who knows what and when and where they are. But remember now, this is winter time. The seas are incredibly bad. They're
Mhm.
always bad, but they're very bad, and the storms will blow for days. So you can't just point your boat and get somewhere. So there's a decision made in Buenos Aires to rescue the castaways.
Mhm.
Uh, and the man in charge is a young Royal Navy lieutenant. What do we need to know about him?
Well, he's in his early 20s and he has been in a number of engagements before, has not made much of a name for himself, but was deemed to be a competent commander of men. And he took on this task, even though the Nancy was a somewhat rickety ship, with high hopes of burnishing his reputation and his record by saving all of the castaways. It was a great opportunity to be a hero of sorts. And that's what he had in mind when he sailed out of Buenos Aires.
His name is Duranda. And at this point, I was about to become disenchanted with the prize ceremony of the Royal Navy. Having We've all read Patrick O'Brien's stories of Aubrey and Maturin, and you cheer for Aubrey as he's always plundering the French. But in this instance, it becomes clear that many interpreters of the prize system use it as semi-piracy, and that's what's about to happen here. What's
Right.
important is that this becomes, Erica, it strikes me that this becomes a story of property and not people. The people.
Right. Yeah, Duranda he was made aware when he made it to the Falkland Islands and the castaways were there, and some of the Americans, including Barnard, were another part of the Falklands getting ready the Nanina to leave the Falklands. When Duranda got there, the British told him about this humanitarian deal, what the Americans had offered him, and Duranda just ripped up the deal. He said, "I don't care. We're at war. The American ship is a prize, and all the Americans are going to be prisoners of war." And his impetus was because of the prize system, which had been around for hundreds of years, and Americans had used it to good effect in the American Revolution, and we're using it during the War of 1812. I wrote a book on that, Rebels at Sea, Privateering in the American Revolution. So it's not as if this was a unique mechanism to be used at time in war. But what Duranda did is, instead of looking at the humanity of the situation and realizing that these Americans were trying to help British citizens, he viewed it as an opportunity for personal financial gain. And not one of the British castaways stood up to Duranda. So when the Nanina came back, it was claimed as a prize, and all the Americans, minus Charles Barnard, one other American, and three British, who were left behind on an island because they were hunting, everybody else was made a prisoner, all the Americans. And Duranda, the Nanina, the HMS Nancy, the castaways leave the Falklands. And in the process, and this is a big part of the story, they leave behind the hunting party that had gone off to get food to help feed the British. And that hunting party was headed by our very own Charles Barnard.
Yes, Charles is doubly virtuous. First, he interrupts sealing to rescue these people. And then, because they're held in harbor for a long time because of the storms, he goes off with a volunteer crew to find food for them all. There's lots of food. The seals, the elephant seals, the fish, the birds. You can eat almost everything on the Falklands, but you have to hunt for it. And so Charles means to rescue people, then he means to feed the people who he's going to go rescue. And he's marooned on
Right.
a part of the islands that he knows very well, New Island, Beaver Island, Swan Island. But the conditions are awful. They've got an open boat, no maps, no compass. They do have knives and flints so they can make fire.
Mhm.
And the big part of the story that is most compelling that Eric tells is how they survive with so few advantages whatsoever. They make their own clothes, they make their own food, but they're exhausted and they're losing weight. The adventures are unbelievable, but they do have one magic formula. It's a dog named Scent. The hero of your story, Eric. Tell us about Scent.
Yes, everybody loves Scent. He's a dog of, we don't know what kind of breed he was, but he was a fairly sizable dog. He was Captain Barnard's dog, and he was critical in hunting, not so much in hunting seals, although he played a part in that because the men could run down the seals, but their favorite form of food were these hogs that had been left on the islands by mariners in previous decades to create a population to generate food for later mariners who came by. These hogs were powerful. They had four tusks or modified canine teeth, and the men could not hunt them on their own. They weren't fast enough. But Scent, with just a word from Barnard, would rush off, attack a hog, grab it by the ear or the neck or the front leg, and hold it just long enough for the men to rush in and club the hog to death and plunge a knife into it. And Scent paid dearly for his bravery. He was gashed a couple of times in the groin, in the hindquarters, and he lost one of his eyes getting attacked by a hog who was fighting back. So he's just an amazing character in the story. And I have to tell you, you're not the only one. Everybody, not just dog lovers, loves Scent.
He quietly just steals every scene he's in, very
Yes.
quietly. Yes, you don't hear him barking. There's one mystery that I know we can't solve it. Another dog shows up one morning. Where did that
Right.
come from? Where did he go?
Oh, that dog. Well, that dog was on Swan Island, which is an island that is frequented by many sealers, whalers, and other mariners in the South Atlantic. So my guess is, since dogs are not indigenous to the Falklands, there was a kind of fox there, a Falklands fox, but this was an actual dog. I am sure that that dog either escaped or was left there by a previous ship that came by, perhaps 5 years, 4 years, even 10 years before. And that dog had survived, just like the men of the Nanina survived on their own for 534 days. Where he went, what happened to him? He ran off into the mists of the night and was never seen again. And I'm sure he died of natural or or not natural causes.
Meantime, Duranda has played the perfect villain and has left behind, knowing that there are people who were hunting in good practices for the American ship. He decides to leave them behind because he's got his prize, Nanina, and he sails with Nancy. Nanina is supposed to sail with him, and they don't make it. So he abandons Nanina too, but eventually Nanina will come around and be claimed. And now it becomes, I'd have to say at this point, lawfare takes over. Good heavens.
Right.
Somewhere between the American consul and Buenos Aires and the British admiral, and then there's a British ship, Hermes. They start arguing over Nanina and the contents of Nanina. And this is where your book again becomes about property, not human beings. The heck with
Right.
Charles and the people marooned behind. What we really care about is what's in Nanina. They wanted the seals.
Yeah. Well, Sir Manley Dixon, the commander in Rio, he was actually greatly distressed by what Duranda had done. He's basically that is not what you do. You don't leave people behind, and you certainly don't make a prize of Americans who are willing to help British citizens. So he wanted to set things right, and he negotiated with Valentine Barnard, but they just couldn't come to an agreement. So he throws up his hands, and Manley Dixon says, "Fine, send the Nanina to London, where the prize court can determine who is the rightful owner." And yes, the five men that were left behind in the Falklands, no effort was undertaken to rescue them directly.
But it's a great credit to Charles that he has the ability, he's matured as a commander
Mhm.
to make survival possible. And when we come back, whatever happened to Charles and his father, the good guys, sent especially. That was a major concern of mine. I was worried about him. The book is Left for Dead: Shipwreck, Treachery, and Survival at the Edge of the World. Eric J. Dolin is the author. Charles eventually survives, and they're rescued by two ships coming in who take them back to South America, Buenos Aires, I believe. But what happens to Sent, Eric? Do we know his fate?
Yeah, they are rescued by two British whale ships that keep going on their whaling voyage, take Barnard and the other men along with Scent. But when they're in the Pacific Ocean, they actually come into Lima, Peru. And while there, Barnard has some conversations with some other whaling captains. And one of the whaling captains, the British whaling captain, took a real shine to Scent. And even though Barnard loved his dog, he knew that he had an arduous, uncertain voyage back to America when the war was still going on. It ultimately took him almost 2 years to get back to New York City. So he did not feel it was proper for him to take Scent with him on this uncertain voyage with minimal provision. He didn't have control over everything. And if he gave it to this British whaling captain who really liked Scent, he would have a much better life after all of the difficulties that he had been put through. So, regretfully, but with earnest dedication, Barnard gave his dog to this British whaling captain. I don't know what happened after that. I'm sure Scent had a nice life, however long it lasted. But he was a great character in the book and really was critical to their survival.
It's my reading of your very careful research that without Scent, they've got a much tougher road ahead and might have quit. Scent never quit. He was relentless. He never got discouraged.
Yes, I agree. Things could have turned out quite differently without the benefit of him.
Now the meat of the story is that survival on the Falklands and these islands, and Charles's ability to rally the other four when their conditions were wretched as they survived. They could clothe themselves with sealskin. They could make fires. They did have the boat to turn over their heads, as Eric calls it, a wooden tent. But they've got no reason to believe they're ever going to be rescued, and they're starving to death slowly, famine. However, that is the meat of the story. That's wonderful to read how you survived. We come to the lawfare part of it. Nanina is an extremely valuable brig. You said it was only 8 years old. It's a great
Yeah.
sailor. It was filled, and the prize court believes that it can take possession of it. So Murray and Son are at risk here. Is Charles at risk? Did he sign over a bond or anything?
Yes, he did sign over a $5,000 bond. When he made it back to New York City, he was essentially bankrupt. But Murray and Son, after the war was over, they went to fight for their ship. Duranda had been given the rights to the ship by the prize court because he was the only one there to testify. But there was a year cooling off period, a year during which their appeal could be launched. Murray got there just in time, launched an appeal, and the court ultimately sided with the Americans. They got paid and for the value of the brig and everything that was on board. And Duranda was left with nothing, a fact that he complained about for the rest of his life.
He did live a long life, however. It
Yes.
is very clear. Apparently, rascals lived well into their 80s in the 19th
Yeah.
century.
Mhm.
Charles goes home. Valentine dies in a few years. This is a very admirable family. Does Charles continue his career, or is he discouraged?
Yeah, well, when he got back initially, he vowed never to go to sea after this experience. But he was almost thrown into debtor's prison because he essentially had a failed sealing voyage at the time and nothing to show for it. And he was virtually bankrupt. So he had to go back to the one profession that had sustained him for his adult life. And that was sealing. And he did go back to sealing. Later on, he became a warden of the Port of New York, and then he became a captain of a lightship off of Sandy Hook, New Jersey. But it was during one of his sealing voyages that he met Waddell, the famous voyager from Britain, and that they told the story. And when he came back, his friends kept arguing with Barnard, you need to write a book about your experience in the Falklands. And finally, he relented. And in 1829, he published a book about his experience. And it was because of that book, in large part, that I decided to write this book, because it was such a compelling story supported by additional accounts.
You also had Pease's account. Pease was a very
Yes.
careful chronicler.
He had a diary and a logbook.
And did Duranda leave a record of that had any worth?
Yeah, well, there was a logbook, two logbooks that were kept on the HMS Nancy, one by him and one by his first mate. They were very helpful in fleshing out some of the details of the voyage, but Duranda did not spill out his heart in his logbook. It was more matter of fact, although there were a couple of instances later in his life where he wrote letters complaining about his treatment that he expanded a little bit more on what had happened in the Falklands.
And one character who is converted to being a virtuous man, Aspel, whose real name is Stone, I believe. Do we
Yeah.
know his fate?
No, unfortunately I don't. One of the limits of writing books about common mariners in the early 1800s, and as you know in the introduction, I'm at pains to tell the reader that this is a book about average people, not people that changed history, but regular people. And history spills the most ink and remembers most distinctly those who have had a big impact. Most of the people on the Nanina, as well as the Isabella, and on the HMS Nancy were not important, quote unquote, important people. So the records of them are slim to none. I do not know what happened to Ansel. He was the bully of the story. And I know that you know the story, but at one point they actually marooned
Right.
Charles Barnard. The four other guys took off at Ansel's urging. So it's just a fascinating story. I would love to have known a little bit more about what happened in their later life. I did not find anything.
In celebration of Set, Left for Dead, Shipwreck, Treachery, and Survival at the Edge of the World, Eric J. Dolin is the author. I'm John Batchelor.